Welcome to the FileMaker DevCast with Portage Bay Solutions. We are a Claris Platinum partner and a group of FileMaker certified developers. You'll be listening to one of our regular dev meetings, where we gather to discuss various program topics primarily related to Claris FileMaker. These meetings are an opportunity for us to connect with each other, to share our insights and experiences, to learn, and to hone our craft. We're honored that you've chosen to spend this time with us, and we hope you'll learn and grow right along with our team. If you have any thoughts on what you hear, please do share your feedback.
Welcome to the FileMaker DevCast. I'm your citizen developer and show host, Dan Smiley. And today on the program, John Newhoff and his team at Portage Bay Solutions are going to take us through OAUTH 2.0. This is an industry standard security protocol, and we're going to break down how to use it to communicate with Google's API and how it can be implemented so that you can log into applications using your Google credentials. We're going to nerd out on some cool stuff, so stick around.
The big question is with the FileMaker Solutions, we have a lot of clients that are using automated emails, and they're using Gmail or other forms. And recently this year, Google basically deprecated the process by which a lot of our solutions that had been using the Gmail API and OAuth 2.0 to connect. They deprecated those processes. Previously, FileMaker Solutions needing to use the Google API either used a loopback IP address flow or an out-of-band flow, and both of those have been deprecated with key dates for compliance in 2022. So all of those processes no longer work. The loopback IP address had a flow vulnerability to man-in-the-middle attacks, and that was using a loopback IP address, 127.0.0.0, and it would your app would basically reload it, what was returned from Google. But as we know, man-in-the-middle attacks can compromise a lot of things on HTTPS. And so they could easily intercept that OAuth response and gain access to the authorization codes that you're using. Another one that we had used for several solutions way back in the day was OAuth out of bounds. And that was, you could use that in native clients as a redirect URI like web apps to accept credentials after the user approves an OAuth consent request. And the OOB, or out of band flow, poses a remote phishing risk, and so clients basically must migrate to an alternate method to protect against the vulnerability. So those two were the processes that had been used previously. Some had gone down the path of using OAuth 2.0 and using a URI, but in order to replace those, we've only got a couple of solutions that we can use. I can dive into it a little bit here. If we were looking at the documentation, let me go ahead and share my screen.
A question real quick, just to make sure I'm totally clear on stuff. Obviously, another option besides complying with Google's higher security stuff is to just use a different SMTP server.
True.
We've done for some clients with Mailgun. Maybe it's worth a second or two just talking about the circumstances where that's a reasonable strategy versus where you really need to do the Google integration. I know for some of our emails that we send from databases, they're really just notifications to developers. This condition has occurred, that condition has occurred, and in those cases, just going through Mailgun is still an easy option, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Mailgun and others like it make it super simple.
Yeah.
So I think the places where that doesn't work is where you've got a client who has special email accounts that they want to use, like Gmail, and they want it to work in their ecosphere. Do those support using a Gmail address for the from and
I mean, you can make the from address anything you want.
Yeah.
But you have a couple of problems, I think. One, depending on who the client is and their IT sensibilities. It's one thing to have the from address be the Gmail address, but everything else in the mail header is going to show the mail routing through Mailgun. and some people might not like that, that there's an appearance that the mail didn't come from their domain.
Yeah.
And then probably the biggest thing though is if it goes through Mailgun, it's not going to appear in the sent mail folder for the Gmail account you're sending it from.
Yeah. And the same would be true for Microsoft, right? So we also have clients who like to use Microsoft for sending email. And the same thing is happening in Microsoft's sphere. And it's not just mail, it would be any API interaction with Google. So once you have your OAuth 2 connection to Google or to Microsoft Graph, you can make any API calls using once your credentials are set up. So mail is a big one, but there's also all the other things that you need OAuth 2.0 connection for Google in order to do API interaction. And same with Microsoft's. Microsoft is doing the same thing. They're deprecating this year as well. Their connections. They're a little more maybe letting some of the legacy stuff still hang a little bit longer than Google is, but the documentation I was seeing was going to put that stuff out to pasture. So in order to so you could use alternate methods for sending SMTP, but you would need it if you had any other Google API or Microsoft API interaction, and so using it and securing it is worthwhile. Looking at the Google's OAuth 2.0 documentation, we've got a few different scenarios that they provide. They provide different scenarios for server-side web access, JavaScript web apps, mobile and desktop apps, TV and device apps, and service accounts. And I just outlined the process, and it's pretty much the same for all of them. Basically, in Google, you would create a project, you enable the APIs for the project, giving them permission to use those APIs, and then you create authorization credentials, and then set the scopes, the access scopes.
One quick question there. So in the past with other APIs, many APIs are confused by FileMaker. They don't know if they can't 100% tell if it's a JavaScript app or a mobile app, or even, whatever. Have you run across that scenario where FileMaker was confused on what kind of the Google API was confused on what kind of FileMaker integration needed to be specified? Yeah.
So it is a little ambiguous. So if we look at which scenario, basically server-side can use a HTTP REST. It's, of course, only accessible over HTTPS, but it will redirect the user for authorization to the Google login page to provide access. And so you have to have a web viewer session, a web viewer open in order to provide that redirect. And then it uses a redirect URI, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And that's in order to send back the response. So server-side web apps is one possible option. JavaScript web apps is the other, because it can also use HTTP REST endpoints. It's accessible over HTTPS only. It redirects to the Google authorization and uses redirect URI. And you can see basically the process. They request a token, user logs in with consent, sends back the authorization code, and then you use that authorization code in the app to exchange for a token. You get your token response and a refresh token, and then you can continue to call with that token. And there's a refresh token. So if the token expires, you can use the refresh token to refresh it. And that's the same with the JavaScript web app. So it's one of those two that we've generally been trying to use and use with the URI callback. The other ones for mobile and desktop apps, it uses a custom URI scheme specific like to Android, iOS, and Universal Windows Project, I think it's called, or Universal Windows Platform, UWP. And that generally consists of using a signed registered app ID. So if you're creating an iOS app, you get a special ID from Apple, and then you can use that in the URL scheme, and the iOS device will pass it back through to that app. We're not able to do that with FileMaker, but if you're going to build a standalone app, you might be able to use that. So I'm not sure about FileMaker standalone apps on a mobile device, but it may be able to use it because you do have to get an app ID. So
okay, that's cool.
Previously, you could use the loopback and OB, but those have been deprecated for that. So The other one that I found interesting was TV and device apps. Now, this assumes that the app can't keep secrets, right? So it's got very limited scopes. It can see the email address, but it can't do anything with email. It can save files to Google Drive, get profile information, and use OpenID to hand a user off to different services. It uses a browser and a separate device. Like imagine on your TV, you go to connect to YouTube. What it does is it gives you a code in a URL, and then they'll generally like throw up a QR code that you can just scan that takes you to a site on your phone where you can authenticate it. And then it gives you an access code that you key back into your TV. And then your TV's connected to your Gmail account, right? It's got access to whatever scopes have been created. But again, that's very limited. It won't allow you to do email. It's really sort of just accessing your profile information and such. And then the last one, which is really good, but it has broader spectrum, is service accounts. And service accounts intended for server only tasks. It uses a JWT, which is the JSON Web Token, right? And it can use domain-wide authority. And that one is a hard one for big companies to buy off on because they don't want anybody to have domain-wide authority. There are ways of controlling that, depending on how they have their domain set up. There's all sorts of stuff you can do in IAM to segment the company into different sections, so you can't have one lead over, like accounting can't have any control in marketing or something like that. So there's all sorts of ways to control access with the service account in those, but the domain wide allows it to do certain things. Like you wanted to send an email, it can send an email on anybody in the company's account. Basically, it's authorized to do that. So they're meant for servers to be able to make certain processes happen, or basically interact with like EC2 instances. if you're using Amazon, I'm trying to remember what it's called in the Windows environment, but basically compute instances in Google Cloud. And so
now the benefit.
Yeah, go ahead.
The benefit of service accounts, you're not tied to a user, right? That's the main benefit.
Absolutely.
With the other processes, you're not. So in this case, you have like a robot acting on behalf of the company, reaching into all the different applications, which, to me, it has its value, definitely, but only if you're not trying to be specific to a user, which in some of our cases that we've used it, service accounts could make the most sense for some of the stuff that we try to do.
Yeah, and they do. They have to be taken with great care because they are domain wide. So if you're using Graph Service Account, it has access to email for all the users under that domain, right? Same with Google. And so you're basically giving FileMaker complete access to all of those email accounts, both read, write, whatever you need in order to be able to send email. So that's the tough one, I think, for most clients to sign off on. But other ones, that really want it to fully integrate with Outlook, totally works fine.
And
can the service account be restricted? Can they?
That's what I was.
Security privileges limited.
You can't. So that I was looking into that, and I couldn't find any way to do it where you can lock it down to specific accounts. Now you can, because it's a service. It's not a user. It's, even though it has an email address associated with the service account, that isn't basically an address that you can send email from. What it is it controls access. So it's able to, if you were accessing like Mail API, it's accessing on behalf of the user. You give in the IAM, you give it permission to do certain tasks, but those tasks are domain wide. And from what I could tell, you couldn't say, only access to John's account and Andy's account and nobody else's, because that would be perfect. So service accounts, because of that, are a little bit, there's more security concerns. You got to be a lot more careful. And in all of these instances, realistically, you don't want these being performed at the client side. You want any of these interactions to be happening from the server. So you want to write the scripts to perform all these functions from the server to protect against man-in-the-middle attacks, right?
Okay.
Well, then
So
what we're talking about
front
is
facing. Oh, go
Yeah,
ahead, Jer-
yeah.
go ahead,
So
Brent.
you would fire it off and do a PSOS script on the server is what you need in order to send email on behalf of the user. You don't want to have it in the local browser or the local FileMaker copy and
With
using HTTP from that local client.
with the possible exception if you had a network environment where the application's never accessed from outside the secure corporate local area network environment, that would be less of an issue.
Yeah, yes. If you're always on a tight VPN,
Yeah.
then I think your risk goes way down, right? If you're in a tight little private network, then
if there's never a coffee shop.
Yeah. Yeah, which a lot of companies require, and so then it works, right? Because FileMaker isn't able to get outside that little controlled zone.
There's other advantages to doing it PSOS anyway. It does give you a little bit better performance for the end user. If you don't have that delay associated with if you just handed it off to the server, it performs a little bit faster for the client.
So the difference here that we're talking about is, we were talking about the user versus service account, but it sounds like just as long as the server is a user and it's not tied to anybody who can come and go, don't you get the same advantage there?
I think the service account is easier, right? I mean, you don't
service account is easier. You don't have to have the user authenticate it. You basically get you get the key pair. You get a public and private key, and so you're supplying it in all the call requests, and so that needs to be server to server. You don't want that to go over. You don't want that to be coming from FileMaker client at a remote location. Right? Because it could be intercepted as an HTTPS call.
Does that still have token validation? So you have to refresh tokens in?
Yes, yeah. It just
it
just has that's the authorization code request is in that process. And let me go down to that one there. Service accounts. Yeah, we create and sign the JWT. Use JWT request token. Oh, I take that back. Nope, it uses the JWT request token. And we get the token response, and then use the token to call Google API.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that token probably expires just like the other one, or has an expiration.
It has your key embedded in it, 64-bit. I don't recall from when I did do it, because we did do a service account in the test solution that we were building.
I mean, because if it doesn't, that eliminates that extra step of having to validate for an additional request token. I mean, essentially, once you get one, you don't ever have to validate it again. I mean, I'm sure there's probably
you use the JWT to request a token, and then you get your token response, and then you use that token to make your calls. So you don't have a refresh token, as it were. You just basically, it's kind of like the basic authentication process in a sense, because you're sending over this. Now it is theoretically secure, but I don't want to get into the security aspect of that one and unpack it. That you just need to make sure that's because that has domain wide authority. It needs to be secure. It just needs to be make sure that it's very secure and not accessible, so that it can't be pulled apart. Service account was a lot easier, and then having to go with the other one where you have to have the user basically approve that you want to use their account was a slightly more difficult one. And so the URI process is what's needed. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling all over the place here. So in the server side or the JavaScript, we're using a redirect URI, right? We get our request, we get our authorization code, so we request the token, and the user has to log in and consent. And so I can show. Let me show you quickly what it looks like on the Google side. I'll basically, in security settings for Google here, you can see under third-party apps, and this is under settings on your in your email account or on your Google account, to go in and check access. And each time I've gone in there, it's changed a little bit, so I didn't bother like funneling how to get there, but you can just Google it. And third-party apps access to your account. So right now FileMaker has access, so I can remove this access, right? And now it can no longer send or do whatever scope was requested by the app. And then the way that scope request happens is I can test for authorization in this app. Basically, it asks me choose an account to authorize to use so it can get access. And so I'm selecting this one. And right now, because this app isn't verified, and verification is another sort of deep hole that doesn't quite work well with FileMaker, that I can get into here in a second. You kind of have to bypass it and know that you're being invited in this developer mode, or you have to get the app verified. And the verification process is a little more difficult. So right now we're doing it in a developer account. And then basically it's saying portagebay.com wants access to your Google account. And this is these are the scopes that it's going to provide, right? In order to do email, we need to read, compose, send, and permanently delete all your email. We want to have complete access, that's what you need, right? So, because at the moment you have, it makes perfect sense. But this is where the user gets to decide, do I want to trust this process to touch my Gmail? And if you say continue, the URI is called and it passes it back. And then we're given the access token and a refresh token, and then we can then test and send emails, and everything should work fine. So with that process, the URI, so you can see we're able to send emails now with that because I gave it permission. So with that process, what's happening is that URI needs to have an endpoint, and you can't, like Google or FileMaker isn't an endpoint. Basically, it's a local client that's running, right? So it's sending out this request. It needs to get that request back, and you need to be able to address it. And this is where Google does it with mobile apps and iOS and Android apps. This is where it does it with an app ID. But for FileMaker, the only way to do that is we basically treat it like a server or a JavaScript app, and we pass it back into FileMaker. Basically passes it back into. So here, I'll just take a look at that code. Sorry, I'm drawing on here. Here's some code of a sample URI, right? And this is just an HTML document that would be put on a server. The server does have to be in the domain of the project under the company that has the project. So
yeah, you can test also in localhost, so you don't have to actually have it hosted.
Oh, sure, yeah. In development mode, you can test in
localhost
using loopback. Interesting. Okay, that's pretty cool. So what's going on in the HTML document here? So this is what a URI is. And I was going to read the little thing that I wrote about it so that I wouldn't forget. But a redirect URI is basically a reply URL. It's the location where the authorization server sends the user once the app has been successfully authorized and granted an authorization code or token. The authorization server sends that code or token to the redirect URI. So in FileMaker's instance, it makes the call, it gets permission, and then Google is going to send back to that URL a response, and we need to capture that response. And so in order to do that, we create a web page that is going to receive that response, and it's going to open that in a web browser, and that web browser is going to be prompted to open up FileMaker, the solution that we're pulling it from, and pass it as a script variable. So this is sort of currently the workaround for using the URI in order to get that initial authentication and receive it to get a token and refresh token. So we've got basically when the page loads, we got an event listener. It says, DOM content loaded. Great, let's do this. We're going to get some information, and we're going to take the payload that we receive and pass it to this as a parameter to this URL. And this URL is, in this instance, PBS OAuth 2 API. This would be the name of the FileMaker solution that you're going to call. And because it's using the FMP URL, it's going to open. It would theoretically, depending on how your FileMaker is installed on your machine, it would theoretically prompt FileMaker to open up and receive this call, in which case we need to have the script that we're calling. In this case, it's Google callback URI, but it could be any script. It would call it and pass it this parameter. So we're sort of fudging it a little bit of what a standard URI is. Realistically, in a normal solution, a web app or server, the server itself is going to receive this and put it into a bucket, right? Or the server is going to receive it and it's going to put it, store that into a database at the server level and provide access to the user on the front end. And in which case, none of this is going to be exposed. In the FileMaker instance, when you do this, this is exposed in the as an HTTP call. And so when they do authenticate in this process, there is another, in order to avoid a man-in-the-middle attack, this does have to be performed on a secure network, because theoretically, when this is happening, this could be intercepted because it's sending the response back.
So we're putting these URI pages up on an in-house server for us. What does somebody do if, let's just say, solo developer out there doesn't have his own in-house server? What's the process for setting up a URI?
You'd spin up a local development server using VS Code or something to your local host, and then use your local host URL as the location for your callback. So you just create an index file, HTML, throw your JavaScript in there, and then localhost would be the main address, and then the callback would be whatever's written in the JavaScript back to your solution.
So if a solo dev is deploying to another company, or let's say an in-house dev, even same process.
Well, I guess if it's just for testing.
No. Like we're talking about how do we deploy this for a client?
You'd have to spin up. I mean, in this method, you have to spin up your own server, right?
Yep.
I think to that point, it could be any web server. It doesn't have to be the company's primary web server, I don't think. As long as for us, we have 7 or 8 servers, not all of which are serving web currently, but several of which are, maybe most of which are. Any one of those could host this callback URI page.
Yeah, I mean, any page hosted, really. I mean, any pages hosted.
I guess the key is, correct me if I'm wrong, the key is that the web server would have to have a valid SSL certificate for the domain in question, right? Mm-hmm. So it would only
it'd be preferred, yeah.
Well, preferred, or Xanon was saying that the callback URI domain had to be the same as your. I didn't actually quite catch that.
Whatever you set up in under that account, within Google, so it has to match. Yeah, that is correct.
And I assume match, quote unquote, means SSL.
So if you have
SSL
a master domain, I believe. I think Xander may correct me on that, but I think it's specific to. I mean, you can special characterize it as domain specific, I believe, but that may not be the case. Xander's done more research, but I think that's true.
Yeah, it might be worth asking him about, because you could subdomain. You could have a subdomain like for us, portagebay.com's our main domain. We could have a subdomain of mickeymouse.portagebay.com, and that would still match because the parent domain was still correct. I'm not sure what match means exactly. Obviously, the domain on the web server would have to be the SSL certificate that it's checking against, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
And is it the API call that needs to have that verifies the SSL, or is it like iframe that's verifying the SSL?
That's a great question. I mean, because in the scope of this, he's looping it back around inside of a web viewer, right?
Right, exactly.
This is actually just coming back through. So like Safari,
Yeah,
Like,
whatever your default.
this isn't happening in the web viewer. This is happening in Safari.
outside.
Okay.
Yeah, the default browser for the user. Yeah. What's Xander,
The actual URI that it's hitting, though, the callback itself, that's where you're redirecting back into FileMaker's web viewer, right? Not the actual tokenization where you're pulling the token value or whatever off of the search, like the JavaScript, JavaScript saying the window.location search.
Yeah.
That's the query param.
Yeah, let's think about that. So web viewer is going to go ahead and get a response, and this is the URL that it's going to get as its response, and it's going to fire that off. And so that would be handled the same as if you were calling that from a card window. It's a FMP URL call, which goes outside to Safari and says, open up FileMaker.
Yeah.
And
so instead of doing it within FileMaker, you could just continue to have your default browser open everything, and it would just be like you're authenticating, like you're using a web app, right? You'd make the selection outside of the scope of FileMaker. It wouldn't matter. Call it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You can have the entire process happen outside of a web viewer. You could have it happen in the browser. Yeah.
Gotcha.
For authentication. It's going to give it the same process. And then the FMP URL is what's needed in order to pass that parameter back to a script. And then in the script, we unpack it and pull out the values that we need. So
just to close out what we started talking about a tiny bit while you were answering the door, can you restate what exactly has to match domain in terms of the domain? The callback URI domain has to match what?
So it has to be approved as part of your works. So for us,
okay.
For us, we have portagebay.com. So you need to prove control of the domain that it's coming from with Google in order to act as a secure endpoint.
Got it.
Because we are already set up in our workspace account. We are already set up with portagebay.com, and that's part of our email address. That's already assumed. If you didn't, then you would have to then you have to go through the process to prove ownership of the domain that you're using.
So then for somebody thinking about this for the first time, or wanting to attempt this or needing to attempt this in the very short term, and that's why they're watching this, give them some hour guesses on how much effort to put into your first attempt on connecting all these dots together.
Yeah, well, so initially I was really like, I was like, oh, that'll be simple.
Programmer's creed.
Yeah, and then the programmer in me standing up, well, 20 hours is probably good. And then, but then it's 30 to 40 hours is more reasonable from what I've experienced. And that's not just the authorization process. That would be making the API call too. But like, and as how long did it take on the QuickBooks integration? How much time does it take? Like, getting the connection is half the battle. Once you have that part out, then the other parts kind of fall into place, but each piece kind of takes a while. So maybe to get the authorization, like not knowing anything about it, getting it all set up. If you have really good instructions, you could probably do it in just a few hours. But if you're having to discover all of this from scratch, I would say 20 to 30 hours was about what it took.
Yeah, I'd say
to
so.
figure this out. And then that was for the service account. And then I had to repeat that for for solving for the user account. Yeah.
Yeah.
And initially it was actually, we'd written it for Graph. So it was kind of nice that Graph and service account are used very similarly, right?
Oh yeah.
Because Microsoft has service accounts as well. They're domain wide. So that transferred over pretty well to using the service account with Google.
And I would say if you've touched any API, that's also about a quarter of the battle. Like if you've already gone through somebody somewhere, Constant Contact or QuickBooks or something, and you're wanting to go to Google or whatever, then it will translate. It's just a matter of discovering, oh, that's how Google does it, or oh, that's how Microsoft does it, or there are those little road bumps, but it won't be as bad the second or third time around.
Yeah. Your first call is going to, getting the response, and then you've got to set up all of the stuff around it. And there's some good examples that like Soliant has for doing this. They're using their own URI as well. And that's what I'm curious about, is what's a better way to handle the URI for this, where you can really restrict and control access. Is it something where we could have the URI that it's responding to, instead of responding in the local redirect, that it's sending it to a server directly, right? And then capturing it there somehow. But I don't, that gets a little fuzzy and outside of what I'm able to comprehend at the moment.
Wouldn't that require that you circumvent the user?
Well, so it's sending it back to a server, right? So theoretically,
you're saying once the user approves making the URI redirect back to the server, is that what you mean?
Yeah, or the whole process. Like, let's say that we just had it open a web viewer, not a web viewer. The web viewer is actually hosted on the server, but you could have it open Safari, and the interaction at the Safari level is you don't need FileMaker in the loop basically to get the authentication. You just need a web page that's going to allow you to have that call. So you basically set up an authorization website that can be that the authorization can go into, and in the back end it passes the tokens to FileMaker server for FileMaker server to be able to use them.
Yeah, you'd have to create like a microservice to do something like that, where it would accept and reroute specific to a solution.
And so the good part about that would be, there's no .js libraries for controlling this type of access and setting it up correctly. So it's less error prone. It's never going to, if everything's happening in the back end and your front end is just the user interface, they're going to provide access and yes, but it would throw you into Safari, or it could be in WebDirect, but it would send you to a web page that's not FileMaker derived. It's an actual website hosted on a server, and then everything happens in the back end of the server, which is where it should be. So you don't have to worry about it, and you're using a more standardized process that's really been hammered on and debugged. Using Node.js or something along those lines, or PHP even if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Could you use the FileMaker data API to fire off that same script with the parameter?
Well, your server. So from the server side, right, you get that response. The server can call FileMaker data using data API. It can.
Right.
It can also put it, using ESS. It could put it into the FileMaker database. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could do it, but probably data API would be the best. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you could even do that in your JavaScript. You could have a function to fire off right? You could have a function to fire off the data API, just right from that. Once the user, does they accept or deny, their process, could that fire off a script to run PSOS just using data API?
Yeah. So we'd imagine this was in a browser. They would click on it, and then they would say, oh yeah, okay, I'm going to give this. And we're in a browser, we're not in FileMaker. And it says it already has it. They would hit continue, yes, allow it. At that point, it's all happening on the server. And then the server itself, you'd have a function that would fire off in the back end that would say, use the data API, connect to FileMaker server and pass this variable in.
Yeah, I gotcha.
Yeah. And that might be a cleaner way to do it. It might be worth refactoring it that direction, because that really removes the possibility of the man-in-the-middle attack problem, right? Where if you were doing this right now and, it sends back the redirect right then, because if I'm not on a VPN, I'm going over HTTPS, it's possible for that traffic to be intercepted. And I mean, I'm not a security expert, but we're kind of going with the general consensus of what we've found man-in-the-middle attack could entail. It's possible that it could get intercepted, and then if they did, they would have your access token or refresh token. Another problem that we did notice with one of the clients is, depending on how the work group is set up, or their Google Workspace accounts are set up, and the same with Microsoft Graph, there's a expiration date that third-party apps can have that access. So you can't control it on an individual account. In this instance, like I can't control, I can say this is going to expire in 24 hours or whatever, but on a workspace account, you can control third-party access. And so they have theirs set, and it would expire every week, I believe. And so the user would have to go through the authentication approval process once a week to reestablish that FileMaker has permission to access it.
And that was a pretty aggressively conservative security setting. That's probably not the default. Is that true?
Yeah, I would imagine. It depends. Do you remember setting up any of that permissions on?
Not for our use of Google Workspace. For the client we're talking about, I guess we'd have to look at our settings and see if our default settings match what theirs were. I assumed that they must have made it a little more aggressive to trigger that weekly that weekly reauthorization that was happening.
Yeah, basically keep because you're going to have certain users who are going to be like, oh yeah, give it access, and you don't want those to be hanging out there year over year. Find out 3 years later that some site that got compromised has access to your.
Yeah, they're a pretty decent sized institution, so it makes sense that they'd want to have a conservative setting for that. Makes sense.
Yeah. So it's been fascinating. So the Surface account, is a lot more is easier to implement from the FileMaker side. Should only happen on the server, of course. Gives you the ability to use any domain-wide. There's some security concerns in there because it is domain-wide, but it doesn't require this process where you're providing access and having that HTTP response come back. I think that we should research, and it would be worth looking at doing it without setting up a web server that's running like Node.js microservice that can process this for us and pass it back to whatever server we need, just so that we don't have to rely on clients having a very secure connection whenever they are providing access to it. The other option too is also if in this instance we're using Portage Bay's workspace account, Google Workspace account. If the clients have a workspace account, they can set up the project in their account and provide access and make it much more seamless. And Jacob, you went through that process when you were setting up and testing for some of the stuff for Portage Bay to use Portage Bay's workspace and use API interaction, right? How did that go? Do you remember how that process worked?
So right now it's specific to my account, which was something we were going to actually look at if we could change that. But right now it's relying upon, since I'm in the organization under Portage Bay's Google, like that's the main head, right? Portage Bay in Google. I'm just a user of that group. So it's specific to my permissions. So whatever permissions I have is what the solution has while accessing things.
Yeah. And so you do have to pay for those accounts. And so, we were looking at should we get a robot account that can do stuff, that sort of thing. Yeah. And that was the same process where you get sent to a page in order to provide access for your Gmail account for Portage Bay Solutions, but because you're already part of that domain, it doesn't have to be authenticated on the back end. The app doesn't have to be verified, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah. Well, no, I still go through the same, it's still the same authentication, but like you said, once it's evaluated once, at least I have not hit an expiration period aside from the token resetting.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking. Yeah.
Well, so that's pretty much it for URI. It's not terribly complicated. I think just in our discussion, it would be, worthwhile considering using a microservice and getting that set up. But as it is, it gives us that ability to use Google APIs, and the process is pretty much very similar to the way Graph works as well. They have service accounts and they have client accounts, and you have to do the same sort of approval process. So,
is there any place that somebody can go get this HTML code if they wanted to try and make their own URI for the first time?
Not that I know of. You could, we should probably maybe make it available so anybody could pull it down if they wanted to.
You could put it on the GitHub.
Yeah.
Thank you. We can make sure and publish that along with this podcast. We'll be doing some sort of. We'll probably do a short blog post to make this available, and we could include a URL for this file if we want to.
Yeah. And you can see here the $ domain, for FileMaker, it gets the server from the server location that it's accessing it from. So when it's called, that's what it passes through, but that could be any server, and that's where it's going to send it. You could hard code it to go to a server directly as a response directly to a server, I believe. And I might be wrong there, but but where the response would go directly to whatever server you set it to. But it's
worth an experiment.
Yeah, I'm thinking out loud, and maybe that's not the best way to think about. But as we're talking, like, could you put that to some other, domain and it would pass it directly there, or is it going to pass it back and open that domain in your browser? And I think it is going to open that in your browser, so it will have been passed to you, and then it passed on to the other browser. Whereas if you were using a microservice that's coming from that domain, the server's making the call, it's going to come and go from that server, not through your FileMaker client.
Thank you for spending your time with us at the FileMaker DevCast today. We hope you found something useful, something thought-provoking, and something to take into your own development approach. Things that help you to be more productive and to allow you and your team to get more done in less time. Find us online at portagebay.com and filemakerdevcast.com, and also on social media at FM DevCast and Portage Bay. Let us know if we can help you or your company with modernizing your approaches and streamlining your workflow. We look forward to seeing you at the next DevCast.